Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. History shows again and again how nature points out the folly of men. This is not a quote by a famous philosopher, but rather the lyrics to a Blue Oyster Cult song titled Godzilla. When we think philosophy, not many of us picture a man in a latex dinosaur costume destroying a movie set of Tokyo. But until Norm gives us some background, you'll just have to trust me that that's exactly what Godzilla was intended to be. An unlikely addition to the philosophical pantheon, we hope that he doesn't bring down the pillars holding the place up. All right, so we talked about it last week, sort of impromptu. Yeah. We said, we're going to do Godzilla. So we're holding true to our word. And you and I were talking about a little bit before we started. In doing research for it, you have to weed through it a little bit because if you look up a famous philosopher, you're pretty much guaranteed to get results that refer to philosophy. If you look up a pop culture monster film, even if you slap the word philosophy on it, you're not guaranteed to get something that's related to philosophy. So a little bit challenging weeding through it, but in doing so, there was some very interesting things and a very diverse interpretation of what the movie was about, which is really fascinating and really part of what art is all about, in a lot of ways.
It is. And I don't know, we might have to actually start with, in case you don't know what Godzilla is, probably anybody listening would. This is a behemoth, a leviathan, a gigantic monster. It's called a kaiju in Japanese folklore. And this is this gigantic radiation fire breathing dragon. There have been 35 movies in the whole pantheon of Godzilla. Began as a film in Japan a few years after World War II, and the original Japanese movie was quite authentically what Joel was talking about. The idea of making some metaphorical statement about man toying around with nature, and specifically about the atomic bomb. And if you watch the uncut original, or representation, and it's findable, and then you watch the Americanized version, because the American company said, we'll distribute this. And they cut the heart out of Godzilla, basically. In the Americanization of it, they clipped in a little side story with a then famous actor named Raymond Burr, who was known to many people in the 50s and 60s and 70s for various TV shows, Perry Mason, a lawyer show, and Ironside, the police show, and so the American Reporter was taking on what was going on with Godzilla in Tokyo. But Godzilla essentially comes up against the American military and turns around in the Americanized version. It's just not the same movie and not the same story. And thus, it has progressed from an atomic power figuration and just great good fun with a guy, as you said, in a latex Godzilla suit kicking the heck out of buildings. And part of the fun of watching it, I did with my son, we watched so many of them, is knowing that it's a guy in a suit. So it's the meta thing. At the same time that you say, yeah, I'll accept that that's a city. The special effects that everyone needs now in order to somehow be into a tale it wasn't the same. I'm sounding old. When I was a kid, I mean, you just were playing the game. You knew it was, but then it's morphed over the years into many things, and so now it's essentially more or less not a political tale, but also a climate metaphor.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. You went ahead and started answering my first question before I asked it, which was talking about the real life background of Godzilla.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll cover a couple more details before we move on. But yeah, there's a lot of things going on there. But I think that before we dive into it, I do want to talk about that part of it a little bit, the special effects part, right? Because I think that there's an interesting psychological and philosophical implication of that. The way you were talking about in the 50s, there was a suspension of disbelief, when you see the guy in the costume destroying the city. And that's kind of, it's sort of analogous to reading in some regards, right? When you're reading a work of fiction, it's fiction and you have to use your imagination in order to bring the story to life.
Yes. Yeah.
It seems like watching film and TV in the early time would have been more like that. It's like, okay, I know this is a guy in a dinosaur costume destroying cardboard boxes, but I'm trying to imagine this being a city and being a monster and that sort of thing. And, it's interesting. And it is the subject of some psychological research today. Looking into with how realistic special effects have gotten, what the impact is on the brain and specifically the developing brain of young people when it comes to violent video games or scary movies or these sorts of things. Because even in my day, right? I'm not an old guy, but I remember things like The Nightmare Before Christmas being scary, right? But the claymation of that versus the special effects of movies that are shown to young, little kids today pales in comparison, right? Sure. So what are the effects of having these hyper realistic sort of, and now it even goes beyond 2-dimensional screens and into 3-dimensional virtual realities, with violent or scary or these very realistic things. What sort of effects does that have on the human psyche, and when we project that into the future, what is this generation going to how's that going to impact storytelling and how they approach fictional tales?
It's a good question. It's a very good question because it's still ultimately storytelling. And I think I'm trying to put myself in a position of if I'd heard a Godzilla story before I ever saw a Godzilla movie, which wasn't going to happen. There was like Doctor Who or other kinds of many different actors playing the role, male and now female. The Godzilla of the first film and the Godzilla of the one that was out a year or two ago are almost unrecognizable in things such as size.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Godzilla's gone from like an 80-foot monster to a 400-foot monster. So, of course, when you can do more special effects, everything can get bigger, and including the walloping fib that one has to tell oneself that such a creature could exist, its bone structure could exist, whatever. But you don't go to the movie to do analyzing all of that until after.
Right.
But still, with your question about storytelling, I think that if you get to a place where the only thing that will scare you is a fully realized creature in 3 dimensions, I'm really not sure that we could get there. I still think you could scare any generation if you tell a story right, especially if you're around a campfire and you have a stick and a stone nearby you and can snap it with one hand just at the right moment when something's coming,
Right.
But I do think that it's psychologically unanswerable necessarily yet. To what degree? I think the more you have everything shaped for you in such explicit detail, perhaps the less you are inclined to imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's ways of looking. I think M. Night Shyamalan is probably the closest in modern times where somebody that doesn't rely on special effects to still tell a sort of scary story, right? So that's sort of a triumph of storytelling over special effects in a lot of ways. Um, but yeah, I think that there's two issues you're looking at there. Is one is how does hyper realistic effects impact the psychology of a developing brain, and then the other side of that coin is what is the impact on storytelling of these hyper realistic tools, right? How does storytelling suffer? And I think that is an interesting one. And that's what I'd like to see a little bit more research on. I've been reading some studies about creativity recently, and they found one of the interesting ones that I read was that creative people tell a lot of stories. And my wife will tell you this because I don't generally think of myself as being very accomplished, but I think of myself as being pretty creative. And she's always yelling at me for just making up very long, intricate stories.
But it's fun, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of them, and some of them are just flights of fancy, and some of them are so realistic that she asks me, "Well, is that true?" And lots of times I'll be telling her actual facts, and she'll be like, "Wait a minute, is that true? Or are you just making this up?" She doesn't even know anymore.
Right.
And so yeah, so if creativity, human creativity, is sort of influenced by this ability to generate stories and imagine things that aren't there and sort of tie these things together. Does hyper realistic special effects, the ability to just have these things sort of handed to you, do you think that's detrimental to the development of original creative stories within your mind, or does it help? Does it give you more?
I'm reversing my over generalized statement of a few minutes ago. I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking, no. As an example, so a kid, a very small kid, a toddler, let's suppose they enjoy The Lion King and Scar and or any monster, any villain, let's say. Ursula in The Little Mermaid. All right. But then the child engages, and yes, I'm talking from personal experience, the child engages with you to tell a completely different story with Ursula or Scar. They aren't locked into the story that they see in a movie necessarily. My granddaughter has given me so many gifts of presence over the years, but very apropos to what we're talking about now. She's developed a recent phrase, tell me a story by mouth, as opposed to read me the story. She sometimes wants to read, sometimes wants to look at the book herself and call it reading, of course, and sometimes just tell me a story by mouth. And I rather like that because that's a cue that I know I'm supposed to be making something up. And I have no trouble doing that because it's like you, it's creative. Oh, tell me a story about this cookie. Okay, once upon a time, and on we go. So I don't think that necessarily it's a detriment if the child has an environment and an inner structure that is happy to take in and manipulate those things. I mean, it might be vaguely arguable that Godzilla is part of the collective unconscious that Jung proposed long ago, or Gojira, which is what the original name was in the Japanese language. But monsters, certainly, we talk about back to the saber-toothed tiger, which you occasionally dreamed about, and but of course the monsters are in our heads. They're always going to be in our heads.
Yeah, so that was a little bit of a tangent about storytelling, but I think that it is applicable to Godzilla. So people who tuned in for Godzilla, don't tune out just yet. We're going to get into it. But yeah, I think that is an important aspect of it, the collective unconscious part. Because when I think of Godzilla, I think of Cthulhu, right? It just immediately pops to mind. And, is there any way of knowing if the creator of Godzilla had any sort of interaction with that story, or if he thought about, the nuclear aspect, of World War II and built his own story,
Oh, you mean for Lovecraft, for Cthulhu?
Yeah.
Or
because it seems like it would be very far fetched to think that he had any sort of interactions with Lovecraft.
Right. I mean, Lovecraft was gone before Godzilla entered the pantheon, so to speak. But still, the idea of gigantic old ones. I mean, that's really the commonality.
Yeah, and there's another culture, I can't remember who, but they had a story about a large sea creature that it was sleeping, and it would look like mountains on the sea, but occasionally it would awaken, and it was this giant fish, right?
And then you can go to the Bible with Leviathan. I mean, if you I can't quote exactly, the paraphrase wouldn't be powerful enough, but essentially, consider Leviathan the gigantic sleeping beast who will rise. I mean, and Norse mythology has Fenris wolf and Surtur, the gigantic flaming creature. We just like to make these gigantic things.
Yeah, and I think that the history of Godzilla speaks to that a little bit. Like you said, he started out 50 meters high. He's up to like 300 meters high or something now. He keeps getting bigger. And so...
But our skyscrapers get bigger, don't they? You can't have... I mean, part of that, and I didn't mean to interrupt you on that, but so we have a 150-foot creature stumbling along among buildings that are 800-900 feet. It's not going to be all that... I mean, it'll be impressive. King Kong was impressive in the 30s, when the movie comes out, claymation and all that. But King Kong is... If I saw a little graphic that took the original King Kong and the current King Kong, and it's the same thing.
Right. Yeah, they get bigger. And so the thing is, I don't think the monsters need to get bigger to be scarier, right? Like if you think about it, or you have Godzilla, you have Jurassic Park, right? These are essentially, for all intents and purposes, dinosaur-sized dinosaurs. Right. They don't scale them up multitudes of times. Right. But I think that's because the nature of the monster is different, right? Dinosaurs are scary in and of themselves. So Godzilla doesn't have to be big to be scary if all we're talking about is the physical imposition.
Right.
There's a metaphorical thing going on there. He has to be overwhelming, right? That's part of the story. So we'll head into that. First off, is there any other real life background to Godzilla that we should discuss before we head into the fictional part?
I don't think so. I think it is enough to just the quick review. It's enough to say that the conception of the Japanese production company and the writer and producer was changed relatively soon after the original movie came out. But it is, we mustn't forget that it is anchored in a Japanese folkloric storytelling of a kind that wasn't ours.
Yeah, I think that is the important part to cover with the real background of Godzilla is that the creator of Godzilla, he imagined this being a powerful philosophical statement about nuclear weapons, to the point where he actually said that he thought that the film might end war. He thought it would be that powerful. It obviously didn't pan out that way, and it was probably for a number of reasons. One might be, he was overestimating maybe the special effects of the time. He originally imagined it being stop action. They ended up running out of time and budget, and so he had to put a guy in a suit. Which might have added to the entertainment aspect of it, but not to the sort of emotional or intellectual punch of it. But the biggest part that you talked about at the beginning was that when it was imported to United States audience, the message behind Godzilla was stripped away and was purely presented as an entertainment piece rather than something trying to make a political or humanistic statement.
And then as the productions went on, and for some people, it became more and more, well, I don't know, we want to go to this place yet. You were asking about, is there anything else we should say about the origins? And I think we've done that.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think, it's so we'll head into the fictional origins of Godzilla. So what in the Godzilla universe, tell us about Godzilla.
Well, the interesting thing is, like so many mythologies, there's more than one creation story, let's say. So Godzilla is awakened, this behemoth that is awakened by being drawn to atomic power. The idea was that that Godzilla is the ultimate apex predator, but a couple of these monsters retreated toward the center, the core of the Earth, which couldn't do. But anyway, it gets closer to that, because in their own primeval time, they were consuming radiation to live. But then the bombs start exploding and being tested and drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that interests the story that Godzilla is drawn up to the radiation for food. All right, and then it shows us what for when he applies his own radiation. But then we have other iterations where Godzilla goes back into the ocean. Sometimes in some of the movies, Godzilla breaks out of a glacier or an iceberg, which would take a long time to form around such a creature. So it's like, oh, he just went back in the ocean, suddenly got into an iceberg. So no, maybe we're in a multiversal thing now. I think that's how they would frame it now. We weren't talking about such things back then. Well, in this Earth, this is how Godzilla shows up. Then we have Space Godzilla, because who's similar to Godzilla, but gets his power from crystals, and he's sent by aliens. There's a whole sub-story where there's these aliens that keep trying to conquer Earth by sending Godzilla-like monsters at the Earth. So they're a cluster of filmic versions of this from Planet X or whatever, and Godzilla becomes the hero of Earth. And so, he demolishes a couple of cities at the start, but then he's keeping us safe. And so then you can weave all of atomic power it's not too hard to follow the dots. It's very destructive, but it can also be used to keep us well.
Right.
And then there's King Ghidorah, the three-headed dragon, and Gamera, and sort of a turtleish creature, and just a whole string of these things. Godzilla versus this, Godzilla versus that, and usually it's like any Batman movie. There are 3 or 4 villainous monsters coming after poor old Godzilla. But the most recent one, Godzilla is defeated by mammals, because King Kong defeats Godzilla and subjugates Godzilla in the last movie that came out. I was not happy with that movie for a lot of reasons. It had tremendous special effects. I don't think it knew what it was trying to accomplish, and it certainly didn't accomplish. So they've woven this whole tale of going back into the center of the Earth, where gravity makes things look like the Avatar movie, and all of these different creatures there. And King Kong, this ancient image of King Kong, a big old throne that King Kong goes down to sit on, and everything. And what are we doing here? Now we're making sentient, gigantic monsters, and they're calling them Titans. And so we're spilling into Greek mythology, and kaiju and Titan aren't the same kind of thing. So it's getting really messy.
Yeah, and I think that last point, there's a lot in there as far as storytelling. I mean, to start with, looking at Godzilla's origins, that's kind of cool, because that sort of ties back to what we were talking about with storytelling, right? Creativity and storytelling, it'll take on a life of its own, right? Somebody's going to come along and say, well, you know what? I'm not real happy with this origin, so I'm going to create a different one.
Sure, and that's fine. Yeah.
But then on the tail end of that, talking about sentient monsters and that sort of thing, from everything that I read, that is antithetical to what Godzilla was about.
Yes.
Godzilla as a figure, his purpose was to be this overwhelming force that didn't care about humans, right? He might destroy all of Tokyo, and he might defend it against a monster, but he doesn't know that's not his intent. It's not to protect humans or destroy humans.
Right.
He's just this overwhelming force that does what he does, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no sentience there. There's nothing that's calculating about it, which fits into sort of the metaphorical framework of what he was meant to be.
It makes it more frightening.
Yeah.
And for me, this is oddly a connection to the Alien film. When the alien was just the alien and it was chasing you around, the universe was very cold and very scary and very vast. And there were things that were totally not understandable by us. And that was really the background for the Alien film. And back to Godzilla, that was the background for the original. Then it becomes almost this comic thing. What can we do next? I remember it wasn't the original Destroy All Monsters, but I think it was a remake of Destroy All Monsters. I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, whatever it was. And you've got these, one of the monsters doing a sort of a sideways leap like a soccer player to stop a mountain from hitting it, protecting people. So monster as superhero is just ridiculous. I mean, you sit and you laugh and okay, that's fine, but you weren't sitting and laughing for the most part at the antics of Godzilla.
Yeah. So we'll get into this a little bit. Do you think that there's other characters or aspects of Godzilla's story that contribute to his overall narrative, or do you think that after the Americanized version sort of stripped Godzilla of his message, these other characters or elements of the story were just added in for entertainment purposes? Do you think that any of them serve a purpose philosophically or narratively?
To play with, I think that they have a purpose in the story because and I won't get into all the specifics of it. Then we've got this messiness with Toho Studios, which also has this relationship with American distribution. So got to have a new monster. Sometimes you bring the old monster back. But I mean, part of it is just for the novelty. But then you get into gigantic robots that humans manufacture. Let's build a robot the same size as Godzilla to take out Godzilla. Hey, why don't we build a robot that's a lot bigger than Godzilla? And then we can, no, it's always the same size, right? And we'll put a giant saw in his chest, as well as laser beams and claws. So we have metal, titanium claws, whatever. And it turns Godzilla into Superman.
Mm-hmm.
It finds a little kryptonite, so to speak, but Godzilla always rises back up. And so I think they serve the purpose of trying to somehow say that human beings are technologically creative, but the natural force will win out.
Yeah, there's a fascinating interplay there that obviously was not intended in the original Godzilla, right? I think that the original Godzilla was meant to be a solitary creature, and that is what gave him his power, is you have this titanic creature that shows up that doesn't care about humans one way or the other. And that's terrifying. And there's nothing that you can do to stop him. Your weapons are useless against him. All these things are, and that's the story that reinforces the nuclear metaphor, and to a lot of extent the climate change metaphor that wasn't intended at that point in time, but has sort of developed.
Yeah.
I think when you introduce the other creatures, now it's changed into really just a boxing match with monsters, right? So
Rock'em Sock'em robots.
And then what happens is the interplay gets interesting because you wonder to yourself, well, what is the human's role in this story then, right? If you have these two monsters boxing and we're just ants on the boxing mat, what is the human story? And then they sort of try to manufacture one, right? Where humans are in some ways attempting to manipulate the monsters or
work together to find a different solution.
Right. It's human ingenuity or humans' ability to manipulate these titanic forces. But Mechagodzilla, which you've mentioned a couple times to me, is really that's sort of, I can't make up my mind, right? Is that the saddest, like, the peak of the worst part of the manipulation of the Godzilla story, or is it the best part, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
like I just mentioned, the original Godzilla story, the whole point of it was that he's this solitary creature that, is putting mankind at his mercy. Mechagodzilla is diametrically opposed to that story, right? It's saying, okay, here's this overwhelming natural force, and humanity is going to create something with technology that can challenge it, right? Now, I think that probably, that if you stopped there, it sounds terrible, right? Like, okay, well, we've completely missed the point of the entire Godzilla story. Congratulations, right? But Mechagodzilla doesn't ever win, really.
No, Mechagodzilla gets ripped to shreds many times. The human beings inside the robot. Well, first we got to admit it's cool for models and merchandising.
Yes, there's a lot of selling toys,
and it's fun. It's fun. I won't throw stones about that. It has a degree of fun, just like any other kind of storytelling does. But yeah, I think it's an attempt. Well, there's an article that I was reading wherein the writer is. I'm not entirely in sync with the writer about this, but the writer is suggesting that the Godzilla in most of the films is about pessimism, and I don't know if you encountered that article or not.
No, I didn't read that one.
I'll have to forward it to you. But that there is one Godzilla that's an outlier. The Shin Godzilla, which was relatively recent, within the past 6 years, I think. And in this, human beings managed to create a biological answer to making Godzilla dormant, but the philosophical viewpoint in the writer of the article is saying it's unacceptable. Godzilla can't exist. In other stories, Godzilla really can't exist, but not for the reasons we'd say the bone structure wouldn't hold such a creature. Godzilla can't exist because Godzilla is pessimism itself, and pessimism itself just simply cannot exist. That's where the writer is going, and you read it and say, "Now, wait a minute." But the argument tends to this thesis that human beings, when they roll over and play dead, and just acquiesce to the power's too big and there's nothing we can do about it, so it's just going to trump us. That's when we're at our worst. And when we're at our best, we use our technology and our smarts to overcome a problem, knowing full well that, like any Herculean Hydra monster, you're going to lop off a head and two more are going to take its place. And so you're going to solve a problem, but that in turn is going to create more problems. But that's the very nature of human interaction with the world itself. But ultimately, human beings prevail. That was I found it interesting to read. I found it a little bit repellent in places because of the enormity of the hubris.
Yeah.
So that writer misses the boat in some sense. There's a fine writer, but I think misses the boat on what the original Godzilla was doing, which is what you were talking about before. And I think that, you can have some optimism at the same time having the natural sense to realize that the world is bigger than any one of us. And no matter how smart we are, nature does win. Mm-hmm. Death wins, and even if, so by this writer's suggestion, he didn't say this, we would say, well, look, we're going to take care of the climate crisis. We're going to build machines that are somehow going to make this a thing of the past, and we're going to be fine. Well, it's good to have optimism, but I don't see ordinary optimism playing out much yet. Certainly among pockets of people, certainly among small movements, absolutely, and not trashing that at all. But when push comes to shove, if people have a chance to walk or drive their car, they're going to drive their car still.
Yeah, and applying a lot of that to the original message of Godzilla, which is the idea of nuclear power in human hands. I think that sort of parallels what you're saying throughout history, right? At the time Godzilla was created, there was this overwhelming fear of nuclear weapons, not just in Japan, but heading into the following decades with the
Right.
Cold War. And we're starting to come back to that. There was a dormant period where Godzilla returned to the ocean, but he's starting to come back up, right, in modern times.
Right.
And there isn't another aspect to that, right? We do have the capability for clean, in quotations, nuclear power that could solve the climate crisis. And now we have a crossover in metaphors, right? Now we're talking about both the nuclear and the climate change.
Nuclear and climate change at the same time, and yeah, Godzilla comes up, but I pulled up some of the quotations from one of the more recent movies. Nature always has a way of balancing itself. This is the role that the humans play. The little ant-like humans who are running back and forth and having a soap opera set of relationships with each other, and usually there's a kid who's smarter than the rest of them, and these are tropes in these stories. But we have the scientist arguing with the military person, arguing with the government avatar, and so nature always has a way of balancing itself. The only question is, what part will we play? Another one, between a senator and a scientist. So you'd want to make Godzilla our pet? No, we will be his. No, no, I don't think so. And then the mass extinction, and this is a scientist. She has released another monster to fight Godzilla. But anyway, the mass extinction we feared has already begun, and we are the cause. So that's acknowledging the force. If Godzilla, the fictional universe, Godzilla, and perhaps other kaiju just demolish the planet, well, the planet's going to keep existing, just like they've kept existing for untold millions of years somehow. It's that humans might not.
Yeah. And this is a common trope in philosophy that we keep coming back to, right? Anytime we address these big issues like climate change or nuclear issues or anything, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What we're quickly confronted with when we look at these big issues is that the things that we deem important, it's all anthropocentric. Right. So like you just said, if the world gets super hot and humans cease to exist, mm-hmm. the Earth will still continue on for another several billion years until it's engulfed by the sun. Right? Or, if nuclear energy doesn't have a anthropomorphic personality. It's not a good or a bad force. It's just a force. It just exists, and we manipulate it and use it for things. And that's a big part of this story, and that's why I think that the creator of Godzilla imagined the story being so powerful, is because if it had been told the way that he had written it, Godzilla portrays that very well. This mm-hmm. overwhelming force that humans are helpless to stop, and that doesn't care one way or the other about what happens to humans. And that's a powerful story. And like you said, I think that that's part of the appeal of the Alien story too, is there's certain aspects of storytelling, and that's it's ironic in a way, right? We tell stories to have these fictional things that teach us human lessons, mm-hmm. but sometimes those human lessons are told through characters that lack any human attributes. Yes. And that's the power of those stories, Alien and Godzilla. But over time, the temptation to adapt human characteristics to them, to try to tell a human story in another way, that sort of plays into it a little bit.
People forget. I mean, one of this piece that I was talking about, the writer suggests that part of the power of the Godzilla story is that when people forget how powerful nature is, that's when, as you say, Godzilla rises for one reason or another. But when people are have distanced themselves from using the world as they will use the world, and whatever happens, well, there's going to be more oil because there always is. There are so many people who think that oil regenerates itself. I've talked to some folks who believe that it's endless resources because the world will just keep making uranium and
Right.
but Godzilla is the kind of tale in that view that says no, you've messed up, and so it's almost a punitive reminder, but that's still not as frightening as I don't care about any of you, I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Right. And that's more of what nature is. And I think part of it is I think it's inextricably connected with the kinds of stories that people want. If people want a story where the universe is benevolent and maybe it has to remind us pretty harshly once in a while, but then we'll do the right thing. Or the existential universe, Godzilla, that will trump anything and then go back to sleep or not, because it doesn't matter whether we're here or not. So that one's more frightening to me. I don't see any reason to. The benevolent universe story doesn't work for me.
No. And I think in that way, when we're thinking about Alien, right, that is a direct sort of correlate, because whereas Godzilla was talking about nuclear issues and he's been adapted to climate issues, Alien is talking about space, right? But it's all nature. Like, it is all of this. Again, it's that reminder that humans are not the center of the universe, right? And we get used to thinking that way, not explicitly. If you ask anybody, they'll probably tell you, oh yeah, we're just, little mites on a dust ball in space. But implicitly, biologically, we're hardwired to believe that we are the center of the universe, to believe that our point of view is the point of view. We are the people, and everything else bows to our whim. Or, like you mentioned, for different characterizations of the story, that maybe we're weaker, or maybe we're we don't, but we're going to, we're tenacious and we're smart, so we'll come up with something that will overcome these things, right?
And I think it's time for Godzilla to rise again, because well, I don't see I see tenacity in groups of people who are enormously subjugated now. There's tenacity of all kinds in human nature, but as a collective, well, we've mentioned this before. I all the movies and science fiction that I have studied and enjoyed over the years, and still do, I don't for a moment believe that a gigantic warrior species spacecraft lands and we all unite to fight the aliens. Nah. There was a science fiction TV show called Colony a couple of years ago. That really pretty much encapsulated. There'd be humans who would sell out to the aliens so that they would stay alive. There'd be humans who would sort of lord it over other humans and give it to them for their purposes. And no, as a species, we are not noble in that way, or at least we've lost our nobility, and maybe we have to find it again if it existed as an entire species. But there is another level to Godzilla that we haven't talked about yet, which is we've got the metaphor of nuclear power, we've got the or atomic power, we've got the metaphor of climate, but there are people who also write about Godzilla as metaphor for the ultimate wound that human beings refuse to confront in themselves. So it's very psychological. Godzilla is that monster in our own closets on the inside that until we come to terms with, we can't defeat.
Yeah, and that's an interesting paradigm to think about, because it's sort of, it's again, it's human helplessness, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about atomic or climate change or space or whatever it may be, that aspect of it talks about how we are helpless against certain parts of our own psyche, right? And that gets into really murky or psychological territory, right? Because there are people that like to believe that we are solely responsible for what we do, and philosophical too, right? We're back to free will and determinism in some regards, but we're also into heavy social psychology territory, and talking about how our interactions with other groups of people throughout our lifetimes shapes who we are. And again, with an anthropocentric viewpoint, right? We all like to think I'm my own person, right? Like I decided who I'm going to be, right? Or I'm actively deciding who I'm going to be.
Yeah.
But there's a body of research, a large body of research that says, well, no, actually, it might not be your genetics, it might not be something you inherited from your parents, but the way that you were raised with your parents or with however you were raised, or the groups of friends you had, or the social groups that you were involved with as a young person, they do shape who you were, and then consequently, through the decisions you made, who you are, right? And that's the Godzilla story there, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's the you said that very well. I think the idea is that there are elemental or primal moments in any of our lives where things happen that shape us, and they might be at a time when we are so little that we don't remember how we process it, and so maybe we process it through stories. And it's not that there are all these evil people trying to hurt us constantly. There are enough evil people, and they try to hurt enough people, but it's not like every single human being has had that bad fortune of somebody close to them doing that. But there can be things that happen to one that cause one to fear the universe, and I think that's where that Godzilla, as you might as well say, the Frankenstein's monster, or the other, the Cthulhu, the thing, the old thing that just won't go away. I find that I'd love to talk to a psychologist and say, so what do you make of Godzilla as metaphor for wound?
Yeah. No, that'd be a fascinating thing to study. I mean, in monsters in general, but specifically Godzilla, because of the nature of the monster that is Godzilla versus some of those other ones, Frankenstein or some of these other ones. Because to me, from what I've researched, the prime aspect of Godzilla, what separates him from other monsters, is the helplessness that humans face in his presence, right? He's not something that can be fought on an individual level or on a societal level. He's overwhelming, like he's there, right? And so if you think about that in the metaphor of a personal wound, right?
Yeah.
That has pretty interesting implications about how you think about it,
This article by Nick, I won't say the name right, Averbush. It was written in 2014, The Metaphor Behind Godzilla and How It Will Change Your Life. That's the one I need to send on to you. He talks about this wound thing. And, but he's not, I mean, he's doing it as we're doing it, taking Godzilla as the fun that it is, but does it tell us more? But it makes me think of all the different Godzilla movies I've watched over the years. And I can't tell you the title of which one this was from, but there was one in which there are two military guys and a woman who's a scientist. And somehow they're tracking Godzilla. This is where I think it was the Space Godzilla movie, comes in, but they're tracking Godzilla. It's not hard to track. They're following. And one of the military guys, his brother has been killed in a building that Godzilla knocked down. And he wants to kill Godzilla. And he's gotten some special weaponry he thinks it's going to help, but essentially it's a machine gun. So Arnold Schwarzenegger goes up against Godzilla, right? But he's shouting at him and firing, and Godzilla's just looking at him and doesn't it doesn't matter. And you can, and the actor carries this off enough that you can, and the other two characters are saying, "What are you doing?" And he really doesn't know, right? It's that moment of, he doesn't know he killed my brother. This is just a thing. So then you can carry that to all kinds of stuff that is very brutally horrific and personal to any one of us who've lost people or have people going through various difficulties, that it's not really any fault. It's just a thing.
Yeah. I think that is an interesting part of looking at it that way. And that sort of segues into the next question I was going to ask, which is, are there elements of Japanese philosophy that inform Godzilla? And one of the interesting ones that I read was a guy talking about Godzilla as being a Shinto god of destruction, right? He comes in, he destroys everything, and then things start over, right? Things start new again. If you think about it from a personal wound paradigm, then that's kind of interesting, right? Okay, Godzilla comes in and he destroys everything, and then you're sort of left holding the pieces, right? A little bit.
Right.
You kind of have to start something different.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Are there other parts of Japanese philosophy that informed Godzilla, the story?
I go back to the one that has so influenced me that I continue to read about, that the concept of kokoro, heart, mind as one thing, not separated as the Western philosophies have separated the two, logic and emotion, but heart and mind is one thing, and I think that there are elements of kokoro in some of the films. I think that scene that I just vaguely described in one of the Space Godzilla movies points to that. The realization of that mentality and emotionality, the essence of what we are, is all bound up together. When the humans interact with Godzilla and how they interact with Godzilla, if you can even call it interaction, I think leads to some consideration of that concept.
So, does any of Godzilla's message remain after all these years, do you think? Going back to the original Godzilla, we've talked about how it's been adapted from atomic considerations into climate change considerations. Do you think that is some remnant of the original message, or do you think that it's something that's been appropriated to fit our times and our culture?
Well, I think there's some appropriation, but I think, going back to what you said before about the very nature of storytelling, storytellers appropriate things from other storytellers and then make it fresh again, or make the attempt to. That's the process. What I'm thinking about your question, I'm thinking, well, what would happen if we pulled any human interaction out of a Godzilla movie? And there have been people who I sometimes think righteously say, "What, we don't need all this stuff with the human beings. I came to see the monster movie." Mm-hmm. So essentially, what you're saying is, I came to see a creature rise out of the depths, wreak utter havoc until it's done wreaking havoc and going away. Now, it may be wreaking havoc by battling another monster, or maybe just wreaking havoc on its own. But I think if we try to pull away all those anthropomorphic insertions and just see at a distance, or maybe have a close-up shot, like when Bambi meets Godzilla. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's a terrible, it's a little cartoon. Look it up on YouTube. Bambi doesn't end well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's so many cartoons, there's so many iterations of this, video games and such, but if you pull the humans out, what is that story really saying? And I don't think that would have the effect that the original intent was. Do we appropriate things? Do we reconceive things because of where we are in our own particular time? Yes, that's the nature of storytelling. And does pop cultural storytelling pretty much do philosophy. We've talked about that, and some of our certainly does. But what does it do? And is it in a discernible lineage from the original message? Well, I think the climate thing is an appropriation that is true enough to the original that makes it authentic. Yeah. But I think that what you hit on before, we said, well, now we have both the nuclear and climate. Well, that's exactly what we have now. We have the very real possibility every single day. People don't like to think about it. that old nuclear silos go bad and some group gets a bomb. But we have Russia shooting cruise missiles now. That's the next level up. We're pretty close to nuclear. And it seems inconceivable in the 21st century, after all we thought we had learned about these weapons, the mad policy of mutual assured mass destruction so you don't use them. But sooner or later, somebody comes around and says, well, we can use the minor ones, because that wouldn't cause destruction everywhere. And probably nobody's going to use them back against us, because they really wouldn't. So it's this scare game. And I think that the scare game of the nuclear, untended nuclear power, or nuclear power in the hands of despots and autocrats and madmen, is just as frightening. Perhaps even more so because it's faster and we have experience with it. We've had our experience with the climate crisis since the industrial age, but it's across generations, and nobody wants to see it, because after all, we just got to live our lives the same way we got to live our lives until Godzilla comes along, until the oceans rise, until the winds change and you have titanic tornadoes, which we are getting, and cyclones and hurricanes that are larger. These are Godzilla.
Yeah.
And so I think it's authentic for that.
Yeah. No, I think that was a really good description. I think the important thing to point out is that, one thing that we've talked about a lot that I didn't anticipate talking about in this episode was storytelling, the role of storytelling and storytelling tropes, and how, like you said, that humans are creative beings naturally. And like I was talking about from that study, creativity is almost guaranteed to appropriate stories and twist them and change them and tell them their own way. And, I think that while that's natural, I think that it can be for the better or the worse, right? And if we look at the original American appropriation of Godzilla, it's pretty obvious to say that from what the story was meant to tell, that was a negative appropriation. And it encapsulates kind of that American, a lot of the American ideals in the way that it did it, right? So, it's
you can't have a nuclear powered monster tromping through the world in McCarthyist 1950s United States. You can't have it. You won't have it, because that's not the narrative.
And yet we did, but we changed it.
That's exactly it. That's back to the bipolarity of it doesn't exist, but of course it does.
Yeah.
and that's when the monsters show up.
And so as a result, we took this thing that was very openly confronting us about the nuclear bombs that we had dropped on Japan, a decade before. And taking that very harsh, very in-your-face sort of message, and twisting it into an American thing that gives us gives us some warm and fuzzies, right? Kind of like what you were talking about with the benevolent universe theory, and it's not really what Godzilla was about. Godzilla is about history shows us again and again that nature points out the folly of man. Right?
That's exactly where you started us, and that's right. A little side note: I think this is a very telling thing about the difference between. And I'm not heroifying. I'm not. It's not a value judging in saying this, but I think it's an interesting thought piece. A few years after the absolute destruction of um, millions, and or at least let's say hundreds of thousands, but really millions from the radiations of two cities. A few years later, this movie is coming along to talk to us about that. When we had, and if you think about it in the terms of what Japan faced, we had the minor horror all the same, of two towers coming down in New York City. And for years, filmmakers were absolutely had to abjure. They had to refrain from showing any major city destruction because it was just too hard for people to bear. They didn't want to see skyscrapers falling on a screen.
Right. And at the same time, creating stories that are direct parallels to what happened. So you see the proliferation at that time of war films that are heroifying counter-terrorist sort of operations.
Yeah.
Japan didn't do that. They didn't create a film about the American versus the Japanese military where the Japanese military succeeded. No, they created a metaphor for nuclear weapons in general. And in a way, I mean, if you look at the longevity of the film, despite of how it's been twisted, there's something a bit more powerful in how that came about, I think.
I think so. I think it's the Japanese culture is ancient. They know how to tell stories. We don't have nearly as much experience at it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating. It was really fun looking up Godzilla and all the different ways that people have interpreted the story and the ways, the messages that have been portrayed, and the fun parts of it, but also the deeper parts of it. So until next time, keep pondering.